It's Tuesday. That means it's time for another top 10 video. Even though I'm on vacation in Florida, I'm still not going to let you guys miss out on your top 10s. So this time we're going to be doing our top 10 ritual spells for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So if you want to see what those are, stay tuned. Up front, folks, I did want to say I had planned to do top 10 IRL accessories for players this week, but again, I'm on vacation, so I don't have any of my regular stuff that I would have with me, and I actually have the accessories that I want to physically show to you like I did in the previous video for Dungeon Masters, so unfortunately I won't have that. That being said, the only rules for this video is the spell needs to be a ritual spell and an officially published spell in any one of the D&D books, so of course, you know, Wildmount will be out next week, so this will probably change. But that being said, let's start the video. Number 10 is Comprehend Languages. As you can see here, this is only a first level spell, so it's not too much commitment as far as learning it goes. But again, being a ritual spell, that means you can cast it without expending a spell slot. And again, I guess a caveat for all of these is wizards can make the best use of all ritual spells, as they can have them in their spell book and still cast them from their spell book not prepared. But as you can see, the duration is an hour, which is nice. It does have verbal somatic material components, but the material components are soot and salt, and those are not consumed. And what you get for this is you can understand the literal meaning of any spoken language that you hear, which is something I feel like a lot of people forget about Comprehend Languages. The main thing people seem to use it for is you can understand any written language that you see, but you must be touching the surface on which the words are written, which I feel is the other thing that people often forget. It takes about 1 minute to read 1 page of text. The spell doesn't decode secret messages in a text or glyph, such as an arcane sigil, that is written as part of the language. So, again, sorry, there's a dog barking next door. But, again, I feel like a lot of people typically use Comprehend Languages to read languages because they'll find a scroll, they'll find a text, something. But I think they also forget that you need to be physically in contact with whatever it is to be able to read it. And then again, it does allow you to understand any spoken language that you hear. And it says any spoken language. So this could be funky languages too that aren't things like Draconic or, you know, Abyssal. This could be like a giant elk or giant eagle or knoll, or languages that are much less common. You can understand them for an hour, and again, this is a ritual spell. So while you may not be able to communicate back to them, you can at least understand them and possibly do some kind of a translation, maybe use body language, or maybe if they can understand written languages, you can write it. There's a lot of good uses for this spell, and again, for not having to expend a spell slot, or even if you did only a first level, this is pretty worth it, I think, to have in the general, just in general. Number 9 is Silence. I feel like this is one, myself included, I often forget that Silence is a ritual spell. It is typically, I'd say most of the time it's used as its action to actually be cast because it's something you want to do in the moment. But for those of you who don't know what Silence does, it's a 2nd level spell, and for the duration, no sound can be created within or pass through a 20-foot radius sphere centered on a point you choose within range. Any creature or object entirely in the sphere is immune to thunder damage, and the creatures are deafened while they're entirely inside it. Casting a spell that includes a verbal component is impossible there. So that's something else. That's the main reason I feel like I typically use the Silence spell myself as a player, is to shut down enemy spellcasting. I feel like a lot of people forget that it only works on spells that have verbal components. It doesn't shut down all spellcasting, just verbal component-based spellcasting. So something to consider when you're casting it. It also, I think, as far as I'm written, I remember people used to try to, maybe this was an older edition thing, cast it on an object and then throw the object in. Like I cast it on a stone, I throw the stone. This says a point. You could theoretically argue that the point you choose is a stone, but I believe it still stays stationary there. So that I don't think would help you. But another thing it can be used for, so the reason I have it on here as the ritual spell is I think this can be the ideal situation for sneaking and breaking and entering, right? So if you're going to break into a building and there's a door and you don't have someone who can pick locks, but you want to break it down, you could use Silence as a ritual spell because you know you're going to do this thing, but it's not reactive, it's proactive. Cast it, make the door silent, break the door, break the window, whatever it is, break in. Again, it could also be something if you are going to be doing something that's possibly like a torture scenario or, an execution or an assassination, that kind of a thing. You could maybe possibly preempt the silence as a ritual. Again, it's something, it does last 10 minutes and it is concentration, even if you do cast it as a ritual. Like I said, I feel like more often than not, it's going to be cast as an action. But there are certain things, again, I think it's Bard, Cleric, Ranger. So Circle of the Land Druid gets it. Circle of the Land Druid Desert gets it always prepared. So that's good. A couple good options there. But surprisingly, it's not on the Wizard spell list, which I thought was kind of weird. I feel like it feels like a wizardy spell. But again, like I said, it doesn't look like there's too many options. You're going to be able to have it prepared without choosing to prepare it. Huh, there's a lizard inside here that I just saw over there. I'll have to go catch that. Anyway, silence is good. Number 8 is Unseen Servant. Duration is an hour, non-concentration, which is pretty great. It does have a material component, but it's not monetary. It's not consumed by the spell. And what's cool is this basically makes an alternative for people who don't have access to something like, say, a mage hand, or want something that can do a little bit more than a mage hand can normally do. So you create it. It springs to life in an unoccupied space. It has stats because it can be targeted and attacked, though it is invisible. On each of your turn, as a bonus action, you can mentally command it, which normally I think mage hand is mage hand an action to move it. I don't know. Anyway, you can move up to 15 feet and interact with an object. Because it is essentially a humanoid shape, it does have 2 hands, which means it can do things that a normal human being could do. And it lists a couple things here: fetching things, cleaning, mending, folding clothes, lighting fires, serving food, pouring wine. Once you give the command, it does it to the best of its ability and then waits for your next one. So it can do multiple things. And again, it is out and about, so you can use it for multiple things. You could summon it and possibly never need it, and it just sits there and waiting for you to use it. And it does have a strength of 2, which means it can carry 15 times its weight, which means it can carry up to 30 pounds, which does trump Mage Hand, so it has the ability to do more than that. And it does, because it's a humanoid figure, it has 2 hands, it can do more intricate things than a Mage Hand could typically do. Now, obviously, certain classes and things can do more with a Mage Hand. Mage Hand is also typically not invisible, unless you're an Arcane Trickster, or I think a Gith can make it invisible. So it has multiple uses, but it can clearly do more advanced things, right? It says mending, which makes me curious what that actually means. Is that like you give it a needle and thread and you can have it sew your clothes for you? What exactly can it mend? I guess it's really up to your DM. And then obviously you can see people can use this more for like it would be a very useful, just like run-of-the-mill spell to have access to every day. And, like just a third hand, essentially. Like, oh, I really don't feel like folding clothes for the next hour. Unseen Servant, go fold clothes for an hour. Then I'll summon you again. It does say serving food. It doesn't say cooking food, so that may be a little too complex, but it can serve and pour. Can light a fire. One, I would presume that means you'd have to give it the means in which to light the fire. But yeah, again, a useful spell. It can take the place of a mage hand. You could use it for... It doesn't really have a ton of combat utility, although I'm sure you could think of things to do. Carry an item from someone to someone. You could use it in the, stuck in jail, use it to go fetch something like keys or what have you, or just, again, general mundane use. Plenty of uses for it, and I'm sure you guys will give me plenty more other unique and interesting uses of it in the comments below. Number 7 is Phantom Steed. We've jumped up from 1st level now to 3rd level. This one does take a minute to cast, so you need to keep that in mind when you're using this, but it does last for an hour. And this is just, and unfortunately, it's a very tight spell list that can cast it. As you can see, it's just Wizard, and then if an Eldritch Knight or Arcane Trickster chooses to get this, note that an Arcane Trickster can get this as one of their base spells, as it is Illusion type. But basically, this is going to help to make overland travel a breeze, or sending messages or things like that. So a large quasi-real horse-like creature appears on the ground. You decide its appearance, but it is equipped with a saddle, bit, and bridle. Any equipment created by the spell vanishes in a poof of smoke if it's carried more than 10 feet away from the steed, so you can't use it to make a bit or bridle for a different horse. Or if you do, it needs to be constantly within 10 feet of the phantom steed. For the duration, a creature you choose can ride it, which is nice because that means that enemies can't ride it if you don't choose them to. It uses the statistics for a riding horse. It has a speed of 100 and can travel 10 miles in an hour or 13 miles at a fast pace. When the spell ends, the steed gradually fades, giving the rider 1 minute to dismount. It ends if you use an action to dismiss it or the steed takes any damage. So, one point to make out there is this is a mystical creature that is created, so if you push this thing at a fast pace, it's not going to suffer, right? I guess that's a main thing, right? So this steed, you could push it to a fast pace, assuming you're not trying to be stealthy or looking for something, and this thing could go 13 miles in an hour, which is pretty nuts when it comes to like overland speed travel in Dungeons and Dragons. That could be really useful. Again, it could have combat usefulness, as it does have a speed of 100 feet, so you could use it in combat, but be mindful if it takes a singular point of damage, it is gone. It is non-concentration, so you could, in theory, cast it, a minute to cast it. I mean, again, if you're ritual casting, it'll take longer, but use some time to cast it, give it to somebody, then cast another one, then give it to somebody. So you could, in theory, outfit a whole party with this, and then get as much time out of the hour as you can. And then, at the end of the hour, you'll have to stop. Everybody will have to stop. You'll have to recast and get as much time out of it as you can and continue on, but that's a thing you could do. Again, if multiple people have access to find Steed, this will be that much more useful. Or sorry, Phantom Steed, rather. It'll be that much more useful. I just really like it. It's a good spell. I mean, it's also, again, it's a ritual spell, but again, any of these spells you could possibly get as a scroll, and this is definitely one that wouldn't be bad to get access to as a scroll. It's a lot more easier to manage, or probably easier to find, than, say, like a Figurine of Wondrous Power Obsidian Steed, which is relatively similar, although that's a nightmare, not a quasi-horse-like creature. I don't think I've ever actually gotten a chance to play a character who had gotten access to this and the campaign continued. So I would really like to do that, because I feel like there's a lot of interesting things that can be done with this. And I'd love to hear what you guys have done in the comments. Number 6 is identify. We're back down to first level again. You'll also notice that a lot of there aren't many high-level ritual spells, which is kind of unfortunate. But identify is a first-level spell. It is a 1-minute casting time. Again, a minimal spell list for this. We have Bard and Wizard. We are going to get it automatically prepared on our Knowledge and Forge domain Clerics, which is nice, and then Artificer as well. This one does, however, require a pearl worth 100 gold pieces, so you do actually have to get that pearl, assuming that your DM does that, but that's part of the spell, so typically not something you're going to be able to use necessarily right out the gate unless your DM gives you more starting gold. But, I mean, it's just really an all-around useful spell. Choose an object you touch throughout the casting of the spell. Remember, it's a minute normally. It's going to be 11 minutes. If you're using it as a ritual, which is the point of this. Touch a magic item or some other imbued magic object. You learn its properties and how to use them, whether it requires attunement to use, and how many charges it has, if any. You learn whether any spells are affecting the item and what they are. If the item was created by a spell, you learn what created it. So typically in 5e, this is something I'm personally a fan, but also not a fan of, is that any item you find, as long as someone can determine, or you know that it's magic, someone can just sit with it over the course of a short rest, meditate on it, and do nothing else over the course of that short rest, and then basically get the benefits of the Identify spell. Now, again, it takes a secondary short rest to attune to it, is the item attunement, so Identify can help make that more a rapid process, to speed it up a lot. By allowing you to do it in a minute, or in the case of what we're doing here in this video, 11 minutes. But it's just really useful, because, I mean, again, if you find a treasure trove of magic items and you're going to try to do it with a long rest each, short rest each, you could possibly identify all of them in less than an hour where you do have Identify. And again, if you instead touch a creature throughout this casting, you learn what spells, if any, are currently affecting it. So that's good. You know, if someone's under the effect of a dominate spell or a suggestion spell, you can know that and then attempt to disable it. Or perhaps an alter self spell, or I mean, obviously things like disguise self, you could touch them and then they're physically not where they're supposed to be. So that'll give you a heads up there. But again, alter self is an actual physical transformation, so identify would allow you to get around that. But you also may learn that, like, oh, it's this mass suggestion spell, so someone significantly higher level is casting this, so something, again, to consider. Now, again, I really wish it let you know what spells they could cast. Maybe that was an older edition thing, but, like, that way you can know, like, oh, okay, this person is a wizard and they can cast these spells. And it doesn't actually state whether or not it tells you if an item is cursed, but it tells you learn the properties of it and how to use it. And in theory, a cursed item, a property of a cursed item, is that it is cursed. And I don't believe in the section where it talks about curses in the Dungeon Master's Guide that it states that, like, identify doesn't tell you that an item is cursed. And because if that's the case, that really makes identify that much more powerful, and cursed items in 5th edition so much more weak. I almost feel like in future campaigns I may want to almost like outlaw the short rest identification process to force people to either, one, take identify as a spell, or possibly work up some identification kit like you have in a lot of RPG style video games, or force them to go to an identifier, because that makes the potential, I feel like, for people to want to use a cool magic item and possibly attune to it, risking the curse. If it's like, well, I could use it now, or maybe I can wait and see if it's worth it. I don't know. I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think. Do you like identifying the way you can learn how magic items or what they are via identifying a short rest mechanic in this edition? Or is, more old school, go to someone to have them identify, go to your Deckard Cain, learn what the items do, that kind of thing? Number 5 is Commune. This is one of the highest level spells you're going to see on this list. And this is a spell I feel like for an unprepared dungeon master can completely break the game. And the fact that it's a ritual makes it that much crazier. So it is a 1-minute casting time, again, or 11 minutes if you do it as a ritual, and a 1-minute duration. It does require material components, but they're nothing crazy. It's pretty much typically only usable by a cleric. But you can see that Oath of Devotion and the current Unearthed Arcana Oath of Heroism, which I guess will be reprinted officially as the Oath of Glory in Mythic Odysseys of Theros, and then the Order Domain Cleric. So pretty much only clerics and maybe a couple paladins. And what it does is you basically beseech whoever is your greater power, your deity, divine proxy, whatever, and you ask 3 questions that can be answered with yes or no. You must ask your questions within the minute, and you receive your answer. You receive a correct answer for each question. So again, it takes that you have a minute, so you definitely can talk to your party and say, like, hey guys, I'm going to try to speak to whoever it is. We have a minute. What questions should we ask, or do we need to like wait based on the answer? So I ask the first question, they give me an answer. Then we ask the second question, we formulate, we have a minute to figure it out. Divine beings aren't necessarily omniscient, so you might receive unclear as an answer if a question pertains to information that lies beyond the deity's knowledge. In a case where a one-word answer could be misleading or contrary to the deity's interests, they may offer a short phrase as an answer instead. So that's something to consider here, right? So they won't answer you incorrectly. You always receive the correct answer. They may tell you unclear if it's something that they don't know, which is possible depending on, there's different ranks of deities, so that could be part of it. But they might offer you a phrase if it would be misleading to tell you yes or no, or possibly contrary to what they want, which is interesting because that means technically they're not lying, but they could be leading you in a different direction based on the question. If you cast a spell 2 or more times before finishing your next long rest, there is a cumulative 25% chance for each casting after the first that you get no answer. The GM makes this roll in secret. So, again, it's a ritual spell, so you can do this potentially without blowing a spell slot at all. And because it's a ritual spell, and it says right there, it says you can cast this if you cast it 2 or more. So you can cast it once and get 3 answers for free. You can then cast it again, and there's a 25% chance that you won't get an answer, but there's a 20 or 75% chance that you will, and then you could potentially cast it again, and then now there's a 50% chance. So it's really when you cast this spell 5 times that you're not going to get an answer. But there's nothing stopping you from trying. There's no downside to keep going. If you have more questions, you can get your one freebie. The DM can make a roll and you can ask again. And again, like I said, I've definitely seen situations where this has broke a DM's plan or a campaign or something like this, or at least a session where they have like an intrigue planned scenario, and you're like, okay, well, let me ask my deity. And you say, hey, is this person in the building? Yes or no, right? And the deity can tell you yes. All right, well, guys, we don't have to look anywhere. He's here. Or yes, he's somewhere else. Let's go. And then you could say, like, is that person on this floor? Are they invisible? Are they under any effects of spells? Are we on the right track to find them? You know, things like that. You can ask those kinds of questions, which, as you can see, depending on how you word it, as long as it's easily answerable with a yes or no question and the deity has the answer to it, it can fundamentally alter the way things go. The only real downside is this: is you have to either be a cleric or a very specific type of paladin. But again, as a cleric, you're really doing your party a disservice by not having this. And like I said, too, if you have multiple clerics, this gives you even more options for commune, and that could potentially bump you up to almost 8 communes a day, which, depending on how strategic you are with your answers, you may be able to get pretty much everything you want to know almost immediately. Number 4 is Rary's Telepathic Bond. Again, another 5th level spell. This is, again, a 1 action to cast, or again, in this case, another 10 minutes, 1 hour duration. But this is, again, probably one of my favorite ritual spells, but also very rarely do I get to play at a level in which this is something that I have, because it's typically only the wizard that has access to this, though it does say the Unity domain cleric does have that, but that's still UA and doesn't seem to be any guarantee it'll be printed soon. But you and up to 8, so it's you forge among up to 8 creatures, so you have to be included in that. A total of 8. You are psychically linked to each other for the duration of an hour, and creatures with intelligence scores of 2 or lower are not affected by this spell. So, you know, certain familiars and things probably won't be affected. Until the spell ends, you can communicate telepathically through the bond, whether or not you have a common language, and the communication is possible over any distance, though it can extend to other planes of existence. It does have a material component, but it is not consumed. So what's interesting about this is it's a way to get around not being able to speak the language. So we talked about comprehend languages allowing you to hear what someone's saying. Rary's telepathic bond will actually let you talk to them and communicate with them via telepathy, but this is also something that is a ritual, so you could do it without ever expending a spell slot, so you continue to keep communications up. It also is really good for combat scenarios in which you guys want to, you and your party want to organize some sort of strategy without alerting the enemy to what you're doing, because you can speak telepathically. And then again, obviously for stealth missions and heists and things, there's no issue of anybody accidentally speaking up or saying something, because all your communication will be telepathic. Again, like I said, the biggest downside is I very rarely get to play a wizard at a level where I'm able to get to use this. Number 3 is Leomund's Tiny Hut. A 3rd level spell. It is 1 minute to cast, or 11 minutes if we're doing it with this ritual casting here. But the duration is 8 hours, and it is a 10-foot radius dome. And this, I'm sure, as you've seen popularized in a ton of different streams and things like that, is one of the most versatile, most useful 3rd level spells you will have. There's no real significant material component, and you make a 10-foot immobile dome of force in an area basically centered on yourself. It remains stationary for the 8-hour duration. If you leave the inside of the dome, then the spell ends. 9 creatures of up to medium size or smaller can fit in the dome with you. So that means a total of 10 medium or small size creatures. So that's typically a party, 10. Typically party is usually medium or smaller creatures, and 10 people fitting inside there. It'll probably be a little cramped, but you could do it. The spell fails if if its area includes a larger creature or more than 9 creatures. Creatures and objects within the dome when you cast the spell can move through it freely. All other creatures and objects are barred from passing through. Spells and other magical effects can extend through the dome. Can't extend through the dome or be cast through it. The atmosphere inside the space is comfortable and dry, regardless of the weather outside. Until the spell ends, you can command the interior to be completely dim, or to be dimly lit or dark. The dome is opaque from the outside, or any color you choose, but it is transparent from the inside. So again, I don't think I really need to dive too far into why this is a useful spell. It's a great way to take a theoretically uninterrupted long rest. It is a dome, so that does imply that people can't dig, or people could theoretically dig up from underneath and get in the dome that way. Obviously, it could just be dispelled from the outside as something. You get to choose the outside, so if you're choosing to be like, I don't know, let's say in a desert, you could make it look like the sand color so it'll blend in. If you're in a cave, you could just make it black. If you're hiding in a corner in a snowy area, you can make it white like snow. And then, as long as you put yourself in a reasonable position, it won't look out of place. But it works like a two-way mirror, so people couldn't see in, but you could see out. And you can make it dark in the inside or dimly lit. And you can still cast spells within it, but you can't cast spells through it. Spells can't come back into it, so enemies can't cast into your dome, and you can't cast out of it. But there's nothing to say you couldn't cast spells within it. So, like, let's say you're all inside the dome and you're hurt, you could cast Cure Wounds and heal people while within it if you're not going to be taking a long rest. It does also say creatures and objects within the dome can move through it freely. So as long as you want to make sure you have your whole party inside when you cast it so that they can go in and out. But other than that, it sounds like all other objects and creatures are barred from passing through. So that means things like swords, arrows, any of that kind of stuff on the outside can't penetrate through it, but you could. So there's nothing saying you couldn't shoot arrows out of the dome. So it could become like a mobile fortress as long as you have items or weapons that could exit out. And there's no reason that you possibly couldn't pop out as one of the other characters, fight, and then duck back into the dome to protect yourself. So there's some options for it, and again, I'm sure you guys have thought of a bunch of other ways. There's always the concept of like the two wizards doing the time in a hut kind of centipede across the field. So you start casting it inside, and then step out, and then you cast another dome, and then everybody moves into that one. So that way people can kind of make a mobile, moving, impenetrable fortress kind of a thing. I don't think that technically works, rules as written, but it's a cool concept anyway. So we talked about the usefulness of Identify already. So number 2 is Detect Magic, because I would say arguably Detect Magic is almost more useful than Identify. Again, as I stated when I mentioned it, you still need to know the thing is magical before you can identify it, and Detect Magic lets you do that. Again, a first level spell. This is a concentration spell, but it does last for 10 minutes. It's typically an action, so it's only going to be 10 minutes and 6 seconds to cast it as a ritual, and it does have a range of 30 feet. So you can sense the presence of all magic within 30 feet. If you sense the magic in this way, you can use your action to see a faint aura around any visible creature or object in the area that bears magic, and you learn its school of magic, if any. So a point there is, it is any visible creature, so you can't use Detect Magic to see invisible creatures. It doesn't work that way. The spell can penetrate most barriers, but is blocked by 1 foot of stone, 1 inch of common metal, a thin sheet of lead, or 3 feet of wood or dirt. So again, in a similar way to like an X-ray vision, if you wanted to hide something from Detect Magic, you could put it in essentially a lead-lined box, and then it would become, people wouldn't be able to see into it. And because Detect Magic doesn't give you like an aura the whole time, like it wouldn't look like you're seeing all magic and then there's just a devoid box, unless you happen to be in an area completely full of magic and then there's a lead-lined box there. Then it would look out of place. But for the most part, if there's nothing magical around it, a lead-lined box would just look like any other box, and people wouldn't know there's magic contained within inside. Again, I should also state that a lot of the spells that I've gone over do all happen to be first-level spells, which means you could get access to them from something like a Magic Initiate feat. Again, obviously, these are all susceptible to the Ritual Caster feat. And as you can see, Detect Magic is pretty much available on just about every class, right? Bard, Cleric, Druid, Paladin, Ranger, Sorcerer, Wizard, Arcana, Domain, Cleric, and Artificer. Which is why I sort of feel like, in a personal opinion, Detect Magic shouldn't be a spell you have to choose. It should just, like, you could choose it to be able to cast it as an action, but I feel that every caster should have the ability to cast Detect Magic as a ritual, because the fact that they put it on literally everyone's spell list, I feel like it kind of makes sense that everyone should be able to cast it. The only one who's not on is the Warlock, but the Warlock can get the invocation that lets them cast it at will. So in my mind, Detect Magic shouldn't be a spell, because if the thing kind of becomes, not to say that there's reasons you would choose not to have Detect Magic, but if it's something that is like, it's not a choice to pick it because you need to have it, then it shouldn't be a choice. So in my mind, all casting classes should have access to Detect Magic as a ritual, and then if they want to prepare it so they can cast it as an action, that's something separate. That also means things like sorcerers and bards and rangers aren't gonna waste a limited number of spells known slots to take Detect Magic, when it would kind of almost always just make more sense for the people who have prepared casting, or the wizard, to take it and then just have it in their spell book. So, I don't know, maybe you guys feel the same way about Detect Magic, but I think it could just be a cool general class feature for all casting classes. And number one, I'm sure surprising no one, is a Find Familiar. This spell does take an hour to cast normally, so you'll have to take that into consideration while you're casting it, and it can happen within a range of 10 feet. And it just has so many versatile uses, there's really no reason for you to not take it if you have a chance to. You gain the service of a familiar spirit animal that chooses one of the following you choose one of the following forms: bat, cat, frog, or toad, hawk, lizard, octopus, owl, poisonous snake, quipperfish, which is kind of like a piranha, rat, raven, seahorse, spider, or weasel. Appearing in an unoccupied space within range, it has the statistics of the chosen form, but it is either celestial, fey, or fiend, your choice, instead of beast. Not entirely sure why. I guess maybe because it is a spirit form, it's not a technical beast, and that also means it's immune to things like dominate beast or animal friendship. Your familiar acts independently of you, but it always obeys your commands. So again, I think to point out that it's not technically a real creature. It is a figment of your magic that you have created. It looks like a cat or a dog or an owl or whatever it is. Sorry, not a dog. You can't choose a dog, but it doesn't actually. It's not a real creature. So like when it dies, you can just summon it again. It's not like you lost your pet forever. I'll talk about a couple other options that fit that bill when we get to the end. Again, acts independently, obeys your commands. In combat, it rolls its own initiative and acts on its own turn. A familiar can't attack, but it can take other actions as normal. So I feel like in my experience, almost everybody has the familiar just act on the caster's turn. It's technically supposed to have its own turn, which does make combat slightly more interesting and more dynamic, because you're not just going to get to rely on it happening on your turn. So that's something to consider. But like I said, I feel for simplicity's sake, most people just have them act, the caster of the familiar and the familiar act on the same turn. So it can attack, but it can take other actions as normal. So it can take things like dodge or disengage or that kind of a thing. When the familiar drops to 0 hit points, it disappears, leaving behind no physical form. It reappears after you cast this spell again. While your familiar is within 100 feet of you, you can communicate with it telepathically. Additionally, as an action, you can see through your familiar's eyes and hear what it hears until the start of your next turn, gaining the benefit of any special senses that the familiar has. During this time, you are blind and deaf with regard to your own senses. So things to consider with that, right? Like, so an owl has dark vision, right? Certain things have keen senses so they can smell or hear better. So things to consider, or you know, if it's a rat or a spider, it may be able to sneak into a location that you physically can't, and now you can use it for spying. As an action, you can temporarily dismiss your familiar, which is cool. It disappears into a pocket dimension where it waits for your summons. Alternatively, you can dismiss it forever. As an action, while it is temporarily dismissed, you can cause it to reappear in an unoccupied space within 30 feet of you. So this obviously has a ton of applications, right? If your familiar is about to die from sort of spell, or something's going to happen, an enemy found it or something, you can choose an action to just dissipate it and then have it appear next to you. If it does its recon that you wanted it to do and you don't want it to get caught, you can just dismiss it and reappear next to you. Or again, it's with an unoccupied space within 30 feet of you. It doesn't state that it's an unoccupied space that you can see, so you could technically dismiss it and then like summon it on the other side of a wall because that's within 30 feet of you. As long as it's unoccupied, you could do that, and the cat or the owl or the raven or whatever it is doesn't need to, you don't need to see where you're setting it. You can only have one familiar at a time. If you cast the spell while you already have a familiar, you instead cause it to adopt a new form. Choose one of the forms from the list above. Your familiar transforms into that chosen creature. And then finally, when you cast a spell with the range of touch, your familiar can deliver the spell as if it had cast the spell. Your familiar must be within 100 feet of you, and it must use its reaction to deliver the spell when you cast it. If the spell requires an attack roll, you use your attack roll or attack modifier for the roll. It does require 10 gold pieces worth of charcoal, incense, and herbs that are consumed by it. So you'll have to continue to have access to that if you want to keep summoning new familiars or have to resummon an existing one, which I also feel is something that gets overlooked. It's only 10 gold, so that's probably why. But, potentially that could be an issue if you keep losing familiars. So, why is Find Familiar so great? So, one of the actions a familiar can take is the help action, which means that it can choose to help someone, so the next person who makes an attack against the creature that the familiar is using help on gets advantage. So if you choose something like the common one for people to choose is typically an owl, because an owl has flyby, where it can fly in and then fly out without provoking attacks of opportunity. If it chooses to do that, you could have your owl fly in, use the help action, and then fly away. And an owl, I think, has a 60-foot fly speed, so it could fly in 30 feet, use the help action, and then fly up 30 feet or back 30 feet or whatever it is, and now the next attack against that given creature has advantage. That has obviously a ton of implications, right? Because obviously not only is that a benefit to possibly trigger a crit, but that also would guarantee something like sneak attack for a rogue, which is why I feel a lot of arcane trickster rogues choose Find Familiar as one of their spells. So it's also interesting that we see here that Wizard is listed, but it doesn't have Arcane Trickster, Eldritch Knight listed as the available from or for. I don't know if that's just an oversight or not, but anyway, you could send, as an Arcane Trickster, have your familiar fly in, use the help action, fly out, then you attack that creature with advantage, therefore triggering your sneak attack. Again, if you choose to play with the rules as written, where it takes its own turn in combat, that may prove to be difficult for you. So that's one thing you can choose to do with a familiar, a very common application for a familiar. Another one is to just put it in somebody's face, and then have it use the dodge action, and depending on the enemy and the intelligence of the enemy, they may attempt to attack it. And honestly, if they waste an attack attacking your familiar, that's great, because they didn't use an attack to attack you or one of your allies. And yes, it may ultimately lead to your familiar taking damage and then probably dying, but that was the party avoiding an attack because your familiar took one for the team. And then lastly, again, the really potentially really important one, depending on the scenario, is when you cast a spell with a range of touch, your familiar can deliver the spell as if it had cast the spell. Your familiar must be within 100 feet of you, and it must use its reaction to deliver the touch spell when you cast it. If it requires an attack roll, you use your attack modifier for the roll. So what's interesting is it could still use an action to take the dodge action, but it uses its reaction to cast the spell. So if it potentially can't get away, it could still potentially dodge out of it, or disengage to move away. There's a lot of options because the spell is delivered as a reaction. So there are certain builds. Obviously, there's ways you could do this with multi-classing, but certain things like, say, I guess it would be a Celestial Warlock who has Pact of the Chain, who gets a familiar that way. But basically, anybody, one of the big uses for that is if you gain access to something like Cure Wounds or some sort of healing spell that requires you to touch an ally, and you can't get to them, but through one means or another you have a familiar, you're able to send your familiar in to cast a spell. This could be Revivify to bring somebody back from the dead. This could be Lesser Restoration or Greater Restoration, or this could be, again, something like Cure Wounds to do healing, but at a range. Alternatively, you could use this to cast something like Inflict Wounds or Shocking Grasp, or things like that. And then once again, as I said, I would mention there are certain options where you can get access to other creatures as your familiar, but those have potential downsides. Like if you encounter, say, an imp, a quasit, maybe a gazer, a pseudo-dragon, something like that in the world, like a living creature that is that, you could choose to enter into a contract with that particular creature and have it be your familiar. The only downside is that is not a creation of your magic. If that creature, so let's say it's a pseudo dragon that you find and you say, hey, do you want to be my familiar? And it says yes. It does, in theory, give you access to the benefits of its magic resistance. As long as it's within 10 feet of you, you have advantage on saving throws against magic. However, if it dies, it's dead and that familiar is gone. It also is a free-thinking creature and doesn't implicitly obey you like the Find Familiar spell does. So if it doesn't agree with something that you're doing or a choice that you made, it can choose to end its service with you at any given time. There are some other things in there, I think like Almirage and I think a Flying Monkey from Tomb of Annihilation. Those were also listed as potential. Your DM may allow you to summon those as a Find Familiar. When it's worded like that, it sounds like you can just choose to summon it and have it be one of the given forms. And again, I would reach out to your DM if you're looking to have a specific type of familiar, as long as it's not too crazy. I, for instance, in an Adventure League game, have a mini Froghemoth as a familiar that I got through one adventure reward. So it's basically, it is a medium-sized creature, and it basically uses the equivalent, the stats of like a giant crab, but it is a familiar. It still, unfortunately, cannot attack, but it has all the benefits that a giant crab has in familiar form. So again, there's a lot of options out there if you look around for potential other unique and interesting familiars. So I'd reach out to your DM and see if there's something specific you want, and maybe you'll be able to get it. So that is pretty much it, folks. Sorry for the random cuts and the change in time of day for this video. Due to sickness and kids and whatnot, I had to cut this over 3 separate recording times. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this top 10 ritual spells video. Again, sorry it wasn't the top 10 IRL player accessories. That will be coming next week because I'll be home and I can actually showcase the things. Hopefully I'll be able to get some additional videos filmed out for you so you can go and see them for yourself. We are also approaching 22,000 subscribers, which my goal is 25. So we're getting there pretty quickly, and I would really appreciate it if you do like this video to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, please consider doing so. And again, ring that notification bell if you want to stay up to date with my uploads, as for the most part, they're daily. But here on vacation in Florida, I have been a little lax on that. But I didn't want to let too long go before I posted another video. So thank you all so much for watching. There's still a few days left to enter the giveaway, so there'll be a link in the description for that as well. And I'll see you next time.